Hi, my name's Nick Duggan. I used to be a teacher in Sheffield of geography and history. I was the advisor for vocational education in the city, and I'm now a volunteer at the Hawley collection down at Kelham Island. This is probably our 6th or 7th series of talks about different cutlery manufacturers. And in the case of George Wostenholm, actually cutlery is what he made. Many of the other manufacturers also made flatware and hollowware, but Wolstenholme is one of the few Sheffield companies that actually claim just to be a cutlery company. So let's get on and explore a little bit. So in the beginning, George Wostenholme, born in 1717, was apprenticed as a cutler in Stannington. And there was quite a thriving cutlery industry in Stannington, and it was famous for making sort of pen and pocket knives. And actually Dennis Smith, whose collection we have at Hawley, has written quite a helpful pamphlet about the cutlers in Stannington. So 1745, George set up his own business, which he later passed on to his son Henry, reputedly one of the first cutlers to make spring knives. One of Henry's sons was another George, and he got freedom. And when we say freedom, it means freedom in the Cutlers Company in 1799, and he partnered his father till Henry's death in 1803. Letterheads state that the company started in 1785. George worked out of Garden Street and Broad Lane, and in 1809 he registered a silver mark in Rockingham Street. So again, it's interesting. These companies weren't in the East End. They were located down in the centre of town. There you have probably an artistic impression, I think, of the Rockingham Works. So George was working on Rockingham Street and he was doing well, so he took over more workshops. And so it became collectively known as the Rockingham Works in 1815, and he was one of the first cutlers to engage in steam power. And when we think we were having this transition from the water power of the Sheaf, Rivelin, Porter Valley to the steam power, that newfangled thing that some of them thought would never catch on. And he was well placed to prosper for the expansion of the Sheffield knife trade after the Napoleonic Wars. One of the first things he did, though, one of his first problems was his name, George Wostenholme, was pretty difficult to fit on that top end of a blade when you're making a pen or a pocket knife. So one of the things he did is he dropped the first L and the last E in his name. So sometimes you might see it written down as Wolstenholme, but actually the shortened version is the favoured thing on all the knives, which is Wostenholme. But again, I think he's the only Sheffield cutler that cuts his name short, so he could get it on a blade. So in 1820, his father George brought his son, another George, who'd been born in 1802, into the business, and they became George Wostenholme and Sons. And in 1826, the younger George, he became a freeman in the Cutlers Company. And in 1831, they were granted the mark originally granted to William Smith in 1787. So it's this mark, IXL. Now, George Wostenholme was always a man for quality, if you like. And so is this just a symbol that actually you could recognize because nobody else had got it? Or was it something that said, I excel, I am the best? The company still wasn't one of Sheffield's top firms, but a number of factors led to a big change. The character of George. He was highly motivated, he was a practical cutler, but he was a dynamic salesman. One of the quotes about him, he was an excitable workaholic, he had a volcanic temper, which he did not hesitate to vent on his subordinates. And you can guess that his subordinates were his workers. And he used the bounty system to bind his men to him. So he lent them money, basically. And if they owed him money, and they were paying it off over a period of time, they were actually tied to him. He also had a system where he paid them by the dozen. But his dozen was actually 14 items. In most cases would have been pen and pocket knives. Some of that was to build in the fact that there might be some waste, there might be some things that didn't match the quality. But if the workers had made 14 good objects, then George was only paying them for 12. So actually he was getting 2 of them free. So really he was a pretty astute businessman. The thing that distinguishes this company above all the other companies that we've looked at is this relationship with America. So on one occasion in 1830, George had gone to London. Now, again, You just think for a minute, how long did it take to get to London before there was any railways? There was no railway in Sheffield before 1840. So I'll just leave that one with you. So he went to London with a stock of knives. Again, don't know how many knives was the stock, but add that problem in the fact you're going down to London on horseback or in a carriage, and you've got to take some knives which are quite heavy with you. Trade wasn't good, and he brought the knives back to, much to his father's disgust. So you can imagine, you know, taking you 4 or 5 days to get down to London with a load of knives. You didn't sell them. It took you 4 or 5 days to come back. You'd be pretty fed up. But George wasn't, you know, he wasn't going to be put off. He persuaded his father to let him take them to New York in a ship called Sarah Jane. So, you know, we said it might be difficult traveling to London in the 1830s. Well, what was it like trying to get to America? And it's suggesting, it's suggesting the voyage took 6 weeks. Now, I suspect this might be saying the whole journey took 6 weeks. But again, quite an epic trip to New York in 1830. He was so successful that he went back the following year. And he made over 30 subsequent visits. You know, so this is before the age of, ocean-going liners, and so just the transport of this man, and that just sums up something about his drive. His unsold Sheffield stock went down well in America, and he found people over there to make partnerships with. So his first partnership in America was with a man called William Stenton. By 1830, he was employing 40 workers. His father had died in 1833, so he took full control of the business. 1844, he opened an office in New York, possibly the only Sheffield cutlery company that had their own dedicated office in America. He also had sales reps in Philadelphia. In 1850, he added a Boston office. Now, and he also travelled to the West Coast, San Francisco, to defend his trademark. Now, this is the age of the Wild West and wagon trains. So again, travelling to San Francisco, right across America, again, he wasn't getting on a train, and it wasn't like a one-day journey. So the travel was absolutely epic. In the 1840s, the US was the perfect market. They've got loads of immigrants going in who probably didn't come with lots of luggage, but wanted some basic tools, and one of those basic tools would have been a pocket knife. You've got wagon trains. Again, people would have wanted a belt in their pocket. They would have wanted a belt in the knife. And the other thing that was happening about this time was the Californian gold rush. And again, you'd want that knife for just doing everything, for cutting your sticks, for cutting your food, for a bit of protection. So Wolstenholme started selling 1 and 2 blade pocket knives in ivory, pearl, and stag. And in 1848, George was so busy expanding, he bought the Washington Works. This was something that George had on his letterhead. And what we've got here is the Tontine Inn in the centre of town, Haymarket, down by the castle site. You've got High Street on there. You've got Fargate on there. You've got Division Street, and you've got Wellington Street. So actually, his 2 works weren't that far apart, but it was a big step up from the Rockingham Works to the Washington Works. And again, interesting, it was called Washington Works after Washington in America. So he wanted everything to ooze about the American market. Here's again a sort of print of the Washington Works, and sort of a bit, essentially this is a page from the catalogue, but it's also advertising lots of different things. Talking about celebrated IXL cutlery, but also pen and pocket knives, table knives, butcher's knives, Bowie knives, shoe and farrier's knives, erasers, razors and scissors, and the famous original pipe razors. GW and Son, sole manufacturers of tally-ho razors, knives, and congruent razors. So quite a few brands George was accumulating. The Washington Works boasted warehouses, grinding wheels, and steam engines. And to put this in perspective, the average steam engine in Sheffield was operating on 30 horsepower. The steam engine that George put in his factory was actually operating on 350 horsepower. So George was actually building a more substantial factory than many of the other cutlery manufacturers had. He bargained hard with his workers to get his spring knives to a competitive price. He concentrated almost exclusively on the American market, and he ignored the silver plate and table cutlery end of the trade. And that was the bread and butter of lots of the other Sheffield companies. By 1860, he was said to be the largest manufacturer of spring knives in town, and he employed 700 men, 100 boys and 50 women. So a big manufacturer. Not many of the Sheffield cutlery companies got over 1,000 workers. Well, this was all going to the American market, and you can see the sort of names of the knives that he's making. So one of his very popular ones was the Congress knife. You know, it's got Congress knife stamped on the blade. Now, whether it was just that was a brand that just became popular, or whether it was actually the characteristic of this knife, which appears to have had three blades. Barlow knives, which has had a long tradition of being made in Stannington. Ranch knives, for again, you know, that whole thing about the Wild West, people bringing cattle. Hunting knives, self-defense knives, and trade knives. And you can see again that bottom picture, the real IXL cattle knife. And again, the bottom of every one of those blades, they're marked with that Wolstenholme IXL. Bowie knives. Now, I suppose there's a bit of sort of magic, there's a bit of interest around Bowie knives all over the world, and there still is, it's fair to say, but few of these were shipped to the USA before 1848. And it's rare to find one that says the Rockingham Works, which was his first works. So the story goes that an IXL Bowie knife was found on James Bowie's body at the Alamo. But that happened in 1836, and he hadn't moved to his new factory until much later than that. So it seems highly unlikely that that story is actually true. But in terms of branding, in terms of marketing, that was something that was probably quite an advantage. Wostenholme produced vast quantities of high quality Bowie knives, and it reckoned at that time the second biggest export from the UK to America was Bowie knives. I wonder what the first biggest export was. The blades were often decorated, etched with designs from the American market. So eagles were very common. There's a picture there of General Zachary Taylor on his old horse, his old whitey horse. Slogans like Americans ask for nothing but what is right and submit to nothing that is wrong. So there's a big emphasis on quality with rigorous control. And there was this idea of drilling. So all the blades were tested before they left the factory. And one of the things they used to do is they used to bash the blade on an anvil to make sure it didn't shatter. And you can see that quite fine blade underneath. You know, it's got an eagle on it and it's got Californian knife on. And I guess if you lived in California, you'd be quite proud to have a California knife. Trademarks and brands. So in 1843, he acquired the pipe trademark brand that you can see bottom left from William Hutchinson. And this mark had first been granted in 1694, and Wostenholme described this as the oldest mark in the Company of the Cutlers Register. So back at the museum, we've got a book of all the cutlers marks. And again, so if this was the earliest mark, that was something to be quite keen to acquire. In 1863, he'd acquired the trademark Tally-Ho for a razor maker of Frederick Fenney. 1870, he used the mark Congruent, which had previously been a James Bingham mark. So possibly that was something from the Dixon's factory. And then he also took on the mark Excelsior from Hyde's, probably to take them out of the market. So one of the ways sometimes to get rid of your competition was to take over their mark and essentially buy them out. Quality was something that all Sheffield cutlery manufacturers were into. And one of the signs of that quality, I suppose, was actually that they won awards and they won medals at places. And normally we'll see, you know, Paris and London will be things that feature quite strongly. But actually, this is just a logo that appears in their catalogue. But what's surprisingly, in that he also won prizes in Melbourne. They won a prize in New Orleans in 1894. They won a prize in Philadelphia. They won a prize in Chicago in 1893. They won a prize in San Francisco in 1894. And again, I think generally you wouldn't find other Sheffield cutlers winning prizes in America. And one of the things in the middle lane in 1900 in Paris, they won the Grand Prix, and apparently they were the only Sheffield cutler to have won the Grand Prix. So it wasn't a sports car race, but it was obviously a real sign of their quality. And here you've got a sort of a lovely exhibition knife, and I think it said on the previous slide this was sold for $50,000 in the 1990s. 23 blades there. you know, a pair of scissors on the end, well, a couple of pairs of scissors on there, all sorts of different attachments, a nice little, almost like a little hacksaw on one end. You've got the eagle there decorating one of the blades. So, you know, something that's really lovely. And I think it would be fabulous if we could have something like that to demonstrate in Sheffield. Well, this is an early catalogue. The firm was at its peak. I mean, it was making pen and pocket knives, but did make a range of other things. So we've got bread knives here, and you know, bread was the staple food of the British population. Interesting, obviously, this was before the age of sliced bread, so you needed a bread knife. And actually, these knives were before the ability to make a serrated edge had actually been invented. So I guess these knives must have had to be really sharp to be cutting a loaf of bread with it. Most of them would have had wooden handles, I think, and you can see this where the word bread is, it often says bread knife on the blade, and it often says bread knife on the handle. Some of these might have been synthetic, some of them might have been ivory, but you know, real quality products, something that's really good. A few other things from that catalogue. So if you look at these razors, obviously something that I think you rarely find somebody now using a cutthroat razor, but the decoration on the blades of these razors, absolutely fabulous. A lot of it's the IXL brand, a lot of it's saying Wolstenholme. One of the things is they were offering things in different handles. Some there say etched in gold. On the right, you've got, if you were really posh, of course, you had a full set of razors. Now, this has only got 4 in the box, I think. In the collection, we've actually got one set that's got 7 razors in, and you would have had a different razor for every day of the week. Clearly, you would have had to look after these objects because they could have gone rusty. So they were very sharp. They were made of really good quality steel, but they had to be looked after. I've been through this catalogue, and there's a whole range of things in there. These are quite interesting. These are sort of on the left, you've got things for the erasing ink, the old-fashioned form of Tippex. You didn't have white fluid to paint on. You had to scratch the ink on that you'd previously put there. And of course, on the right-hand side there, you've got the true penknives. You know, the original meaning of that word penknife was actually to trim a quill. And actually often a penknife maybe only had 1 blade, or it certainly only had 1 or 2 blades. And one of the things about pocket knives is that you had a lot more blades on some of those knives. He did make some ordinary cutlery, and one of the things it says here, it's talking about you know, imitation, best grained imitation ivory. And the really best synthetic handles, well, the best ones were made of ivory or made of bone, but most of them then became synthetic. But there was something there where you had imitation that was as good as a copy of ivory. Most people, when they see a traditional Sheffield table knife, they think, oh, it's got bone handles. And of course, in most cases, it's got a plastic handle of a material known as xylonite. Well, a bit of another different thing about George here. So the 1850s, 1860s, he was at the height of his power. He didn't want public office. Some of the Sheffield cutlers, there were MPs, there were master cutlers on more than one occasion. He was a justice of the peace, and he was chair of Trustwell's brewery. He was asked to be master cutler, and he turned it down on a number of occasions. He finally agreed to it in 1856. But as well as his cutlery interest, he was very interested in property and land investment. And in 1835, he lived at the Mount in Broomhill. And that building is still there. It's sideways onto the main road. It's being used as a variety of offices and I think of flats, but you know, one of the most prominent buildings in the city. And certainly in 1835, if you're heading up there to Broomhill, this would have been one of the first, you know, really big mansions that you would have come across, and a very, very impressive building. George was impressed with country estates in America, particularly the tree-lined roads and the general layout of Kenwood village near Aneda Lake. Others claimed that he wanted to turn Sharrow into New Boston. But it's just that notion of, you know, let's just remember that name Kenwood. How many roads in Sheffield in Nether Edge are called Kenwood? So here is George outside his house, which was now Kenwood Hall. So the Mount wasn't good enough for him. He wanted to build a big house in the middle of a large estate, and he wanted to influence the immediate surroundings. He wanted to lay out the streets, and he wanted to plant everything around. Now, it's not easy. I know this slide's not easy to look at, but again, they're old documents. But on the left, we've got the Sharrow and Kenwood Park estates. So this was a model for laying out this whole area of land that had been bought by George Wostenholm, and this was in 1853. On the right, in 1892, essentially, you've got the land that had then actually been developed. And of course, you've got roads like Kenwood Road, Kenwood Park Road, Wolstenholme Road, Montgomery Road. So a period of rapid expansion in Sheffield, but interesting, a period of sort of quality housing that was being put in, and tree-lined roads. And obviously interesting, some of those tree-lined roads have had their fair share of controversy over the last few years. Something else that was significant about Wolstenholme, it was this notion of display and advertising. And so, you know, if you were an ironmonger's and you were selling these knives, I suspect you might have been more inclined to sell them if somebody turned up and brought you a lovely wooden display case. And I just love the narrative that goes with this. You know, display one of these cases and the knives will sell themselves. And underneath it says, here is a sale maker for you, interesting and persuasive, not just an ordinary counter case without any effort on your, but a scientifically constructed silent salesman. Without any effort on your part, it will send up your pocket sales to a level you've never thought possible. Everyone that comes into your shop will see extensive assortments of high quality pocket knives. So down at the museum, we have got a few examples of display cases from other manufacturers. Sadly, you know, what would have happened ultimately towards the end of this, those cases would have been dismantled. People would have taken the knives out. But you can see that making an impact before we had television advertising, coloured advertising in magazines. This point of sale advert was really something that would catch the imagination. You had cards that would have had knives attached to them. The gardening knives were quite a big market. You know, the notion of pruning knives. Watching Monty Don on a Friday night, you know, he'll still get his pruning knife out. And on the right-hand side there, you've got the handy knife. Interesting, famous when your father was a boy. So just pointing out the longevity of some of the knives that you've actually got there. Another page from the catalogue just showing the range of different blades that you could have for different purposes. So the blade on the left is if you're working with a lamb and you're cutting some lamb foot, a leather borer, a quill cutting knife, a pruning knife. I'm not quite sure what the saber knife would do, a castrator, spay or budding knife, a clip point knife, a sheep foot or grater, a spear knife, and of interest to salesmen who sell IXL pocket knives. So again, the catalogues were very powerful in terms of something to sell, and certainly tomorrow afternoon we've got some of the catalogues and we'll have some of those out at the Hawley collection. And again, you know, if you ever want to come down and have a look at the catalogues, then certainly we'd be happy to show them to you, and they really are very, very interesting. This particular catalogue, I actually went through it, and there's 360 different pocket knives. It doesn't sound like a sensible economic model to be able to offer people that range, but again, I guess if you had a favorite knife, you had a favorite knife. And whereas now there'll be some products where we go and we want a lot of choice. Well, certainly this was something that Wolstenholme's offered lots of choice. The number of blades was a significant factor. The handle material was a significant factor. It could be ivory, it could be mother of pearl, it could be ebony, it could be metal, it could be horn, and often that horn was pressed. But certainly quite a choice there. Although we think about Wolstenholme as being pen and pocket knife makers, they did make other things. And it's probably a good job they did make other things in terms of what happened later. So on the left there, we've got quite a few trade knives. I like the fifth one down, which is called a chicken sticker. Over the opposite, you've got an oyster knife there. Bottom right of the first page, you've got rabbiters sets there. 5.5-inch blades, beech handled ring steels with 6-inch cut, complete in leather sheath with loop for your belt. And on the right hand side there, you've got butcher's knives. And these butcher's knives would have been made of carbon and shear steel. And even after the introduction of stainless steel in 1913 onwards, basically, you still had butchers that liked shear and carbon steel because it was sharper and it was something else to cut better with. I love these adverts. On the left-hand side, we've actually got one of these or a similar knife on display in a cabinet in the gallery. And I often show people this knife before they know what it's for. The one on the left, and it's a tomato knife. Of course it's a tomato knife. Have you got a tomato knife in your kitchen? Surely that's something that you're missing a little bit. And you can see that it's got a serrated blade for cutting, and then it's got a little got a knob on the end, so you could actually lift up the tomato and you could pass it on to somebody. It's interesting, the one we've got down in the collection was one that there was a big order from Lyons Tea Houses in London, put in a massive order for tomato knives from companies in Sheffield. The one to the right of that is just a saw-edged fruit and vegetable slicing knife, and you can see these for the pricely sum of 1 and 6, but 2 indispensable knives for the kitchen. The other thing I quite like from some of these catalogues, it's almost as if you haven't got one of their knives, they're trying to persuade you that you should have one. So on the right there, you know, it's this thing about, do you eat grapefruit? Well, if you need grapefruit, you need to prepare your grapefruit properly. And we're going to show you how to do it. I'm going to show you how to do it. And you need a Wolstenholme grapefruit knife, which obviously had that ability to, it's had the bend in it. So, and I think they were trying to sell you a 2-knife set there. But as I say, not only were they showing you the knife, but they were showing you what to do with it. And again, that's a bit of a flavour, I think, of the Wolstenholme empire. Well, as well as teaching you how to, you know, cut your grapefruit, they're also teaching you how to cut bread. But of course, we'd had a little bit of a transition here because it says, cut your bread with the IXL bread knife. Use light pressure and a sawing motion with fairly strong, long strokes. And what's happening here is saying the genuine original British knife with a saw edge. So we've now got the technology where we could actually cut teeth essentially into a bread knife. And it's boasting again that it cuts the thinnest of slices from the newest of breads and it keeps its edge for years. So, you know, don't be put up any longer with hacked, clumsy knives, you know. So I think that's something's quite grand. And then on the right hand side, we've got a whole load of other bread knives, and I think again we've got that phrase, imitation ivory handles is one of the things that they're actually bragging about there. And you can see the handles of the knives are not quite as grand. They've become a bit more utilitarian, but certainly, you know, quite good. And one of the things that I do know in the collection, we've got something like 260 different bread knives. We possibly have the biggest collection of bread knives in the world, but we've never tested that out with anybody else. Something else, of course, if you've got a real quality product. I mean, nowadays there's a danger with something like, you know, if you're using a Stanley knife and the blade goes blunt, you just chuck it away and put another one in. But in these days, it was this notion that you'd bought a quality knife and you're going to look after it and you're going to keep it for a while. So they also gave you instructions on how you're going to sharpen your knife and how you're going to keep it in good condition. And somewhere else, it's almost saying, and if you don't do this, don't come back to us and say this knife's no good because you haven't looked after it properly. Well, a bit back to the story. In his late 60s, George was still making trips to America. But in 1875, he had no heirs. So he sold the building, sold his business empire for 43,000. Now, in today's money, £43,000 would be 5.1 million. He died at Kenwood Hall on the 18th of August, 1876, aged 74, leaving £250,000. Now, £250,000 is actually worth 29 million. So it's interesting. He sold the company for 5.1 million, but at the end of when he left his money, he was worth 29 million. One of the things we might conclude is that actually he'd made quite a lot of the money in between. He'd actually made that out of his property empire. This coincided with a big decline of the American market. They had a civil war. They had the end of the gold rush. When they fell out fighting, they didn't do it with a knife, they did it with a revolver. After his last visit to New York in 1869, he warned of the danger of American competition and factory-made knives. The Americans brought in prohibitive tariffs in 1890. And this really almost cut off all the trade with America from the Sheffield cutlery industry. Now, for a lot of the other companies, it was no problem. They looked to Australia, they looked to New Zealand, they looked to the Commonwealth, and they're also they were using other products, but not Wolstenholme, so they were pretty vulnerable. The company tried to cut the workers' wages, and they had a 2-month strike. The new people running the company didn't have the drive of George. They'd failed to tap into the silver plate market. They tried developing the colonial market with limited success. The colonies wanted cheaper utility knives, not the high quality, expensive IXL products. So Wolstenholmes were struggling in the decade before World War I. But their rivals, Mappin and Webb, Walker and Hall, were absolutely flourishing, and they were flourishing because they were thriving on the silver plate market for luxury goods, which you've described in some of the other talks. 1820, some modernization installed American machines to make pocket knives, but the firm struggled in the Depression and almost went under. Part of the Washington Works was destroyed in the war, and you can see a picture there, 1940, resulted in the destruction of 2 boilers, a steam engine, and a 90-foot chimney. And you can imagine, you took that sort of damage to your factory, you're struggling, as well as there being a lot of other bomb damage in places like Sheffield. So you might have been really struggling to get the factory rebuilt and actually make forward economic progress. 1961, they still employed 350 workers. They took over from Christopher Johnson. Now, Christopher Johnson was another quality maker of cutlery in Sheffield, probably produced a wider range of products than Wolstenholme's did. And they also took over the Champion brand to strengthen their position in this scissor market. And again, you know, one of the things we need to remember, scissor making was massive in Sheffield. There's only 2 companies now making scissors left in Sheffield, but scissor making was a massive industry. And these were chromium plated. So again, that was a new method. Things wouldn't need polishing. They would keep the shine. But with many of these things in the Sheffield cutlery industry, you have that feeling it was just too little, too late. The brand did survive. In 1871, Wolstenholme's was bought out by Joseph Rogers. Joseph Rogers, one of Sheffield's strongest brands, had that Maltese cross as part of its logo. The company moved to Jersey Road in Healy. In 1875, it was bought by Richards. Not for long though, because in 1977, the whole works and all those brands were bought by the Imperial Knife, an American firm with links to a famous American knife maker, George Schrade. And you can see there a picture of a thing that's jointly branded with Schrade and IXL. And it is interesting that IXL brand was valuable in America. You know, that was the place where it built its reputation. So even though the, you know, to some extent, a lot of the American market had gone, the Americans still valued that brand as something that they wanted to take back. 1878, the Washington Works was demolished. And sadly, the company records and most of the really smart exhibition collectible knives were spirited off to America. Now, I think a lot of those records have actually come back and are in the Sheffield archives, but sadly, the collectible knives weren't things that came back and were brought back to us. And you can see just that picture now of what's replaced the Washington Works on Wellington Street. You know, and we've got a bit of a supermarket with some student blocks of flats on top of it. The brand actually lives on, so you can still buy a Wolstenholme Bowie knife. So in 1983, the combined business was losing money for its owners, went bankrupt. The IXL mark was acquired by Eggington's in Sheffield after it was briefly owned by Meteor Industries. So you can see over 10 or 20 years, the brand changed hands on a whole number of occasions. But there you've got an advert for a 6-inch Wolstenholme Bowie knife that you can buy today. You know, traditional hunting knife fitted with a brass guard, 3 handle materials, rosewood, buffalo, and staghorn. And there's another advert from Eckington's, and you can see actually one of the things they're demonstrating there, they're demonstrating the Rogers knives, Wolstenholme knives, Ibbotson, and their own Eggington knives. So something that you can still buy. I'm sure the price will be quite expensive. Maybe some of these things might be on sale in the Sheffield shop in Eccleshall Road. A few things in the collection that we've actually got. So these are a couple of those point of display items that we found. I found when I was trying to sort things out for our knife project. And so it's at least two of the things that we've got from Wolstenholme's sort of point of sale. Something else we've got here, and in a way, this is a challenge for us as a collection. And you might look at that and think, what on earth is that? Well, actually, what you've got there is you've got 3 printing blocks. Now, these are printing blocks. Obviously, everything's in reverse on a printing block. And these are actually, you can see, you know, if you look backwards, you can see IXL cutlery. And we, in the Hawley collection, we've actually got thousands of these printing blocks. And it's a bit of a challenge what to do with them. At the moment, they're almost in the drawers that they might have come back from the printers, because all these catalogues were individually typeset. So every image in a catalogue that we've got would have had a printing plate. And say we've got these, some of them are nice shiny brass, some of them are much more a dowdy colour, but you know, a real challenge. What should we do to them? How could we display them? How could we get people to interact with them? So that in a way is quite an interesting challenge. Something that we came across actually quite recently was this little case. And originally this came from the little museum that used to be on Ecclesall Road. When that was broken up, some of the items actually came to the Hawley collection. And somebody, one of the volunteers at Hawley has actually restored this box. And whereas these talks have actually come out of the Name on a Knife Blade project, and that we have catalogued somewhere in the region of between 2,500 and 3,000 table knives, we haven't actually catalogued any of our pen and pocket knives. So one of the next phases of what we need to do is to actually work out the collection that we've already got of pen and pocket knives, look at the collection, the Dennis Smith collection of pen and pocket knives. Now, Dennis gave us something like 400 knives that we need to actually work our way through. There's somebody in London who's threatening to offer us another collection of 300 or 400 pen and pocket knives. So to tell that story of pen and pocket knives is something that we need to we need to move on in the next phase of our development. If you've not been to one of these talks before, just a plug for our ongoing project, which is coming to its end. But this whole journey started off by us trying to work out how many knives we had with different surnames on. We're probably pushing 1,000 now, actually, 1,000 different companies. But, you know, and if you've got some memorabilia about the Sheffield cutlery industry, not necessarily anything of great value, but, you know, something that you don't know what to do with, your kids don't want it, you don't want to throw it out, well, certainly it would be of interest to us. You can also have a look and see if your name is on a knife blade if you go to hawleysheffieldknives.com. Yeah, and that's just a picture of Geoffrey Tweedale's book and just acknowledgements to Picture Sheffield and Museum Sheffield that we've actually used a few of their images from. You can have a look, if you do Facebook, you can have a look at the Name on the Knife Blade group. You can email us at the Hawley Tool Collection,